When you talk about the Russo-Ukrainian War and why it's happening, you really have to go back to the medieval ages. What is Ukraine now was not Ukraine then. It was a part of the Kievan Rus state, which covered most of modern-day European Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. A state forged by Vikings and was populated by Eastern Slavs, who we know today as the Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians. Kiev and Novgorod were its chief cities and capitals. This state lasted from the Viking Age in the late 9th and 10th centuries to the 13th century, when the Mongols came. The Mongols came and defeated the Kievan Rus armies, torched the countryside, and sacked all their cities. Kievan Rus was no more. European Russia fell completely under the Mongols' yoke, while eastern and central Ukraine became a kind of no-man's land where Slavic villagers were constantly harassed, killed, and enslaved by the Mongols, other steppe peoples like the Cossacks and Pechenegs, and later the Turks. Western Ukraine, on the other hand, fell under the sway of the rising power of Poland-Lithuania. So, in a nutshell, the Russians fell under the rule of the Mongols, and the Ukrainians under the Poles, two very different peoples. Poland-Lithuania was a uniquely democratic society for its time. Unlike many other medieval kingdoms, its noble class was more powerful than its monarch, and they would elect their king, and oftentimes they'd choose a foreigner from far away who could easily be more controlled than a local. Meanwhile, Russia's overlords, the Mongols, couldn't be more different. A nomadic steppe people. The Mongols were ruled by an absolute monarch called the Khan. What the Khan said is what happened, no exceptions. So over the centuries, the Ukrainians and the Russians would remain very similar ethnically and linguistically, but very different politically and culturally. Fast forward a few centuries and Poland-Lithuania disappears from the European map, and Tsarist Russia rises and expands. They would conquer their way into Belarus, the Baltics, Poland, and Ukraine itself. In the First World War, the Russian Empire would die violently and fall to the communist Bolsheviks for a whole multitude of reasons which are for a different video. In the chaos of the fall of the Tsars and the rise of the Reds, the short-lived Ukrainian Republic would arise and declare its independence. Besides the small Cossack-ruled states which had existed in the past before the arrival of the Tsars, this is the only time in history before 1991 that an independent Ukrainian state existed. This Ukrainian country was around from roughly the end of 1917 to 1921, when Lenin's Red Armies came in and crushed them. Until 1991, the Ukrainians were under the boot of the Soviet Union. There was great suffering in Ukraine in the 20s and 30s due to famine and the terror, Stalin's purges. The Second World War visited even worse horrors on them, with a good portion of the land war between the Germans and the Russians taking place there, and Hitler's Holocaust. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev had reorganized the Soviet Republic of Ukraine and expanded it, adding the Donbass and Crimea, two historically very Russian areas. Fast forward to 1991 and the collapse of the Soviet Union, a new independent Ukrainian state was born. The Russians had stationed many nuclear weapons on the territory of the new Ukraine, and during negotiations between the new Russian Federation and the United States, which Ukraine was not a part, the Americans let the Russians take their nukes back, in exchange for guaranteeing Ukraine's security. Amongst the other agreements between Russian President Yeltsin and American President Bush Sr. was the handshake deal that the NATO military alliance headed by the U.S. would not expand east past Germany. NATO, however, would eventually include many countries east of Germany, including Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, and the Baltic states on Russia's border. As the 90s and the 2000s marched on, Ukraine became more friendly with the West and more open to European Union and NATO membership. They also began to try and restrict the Russian language in schools and public areas in heavily Russian-speaking regions in the east, including the Donbass and Crimea. Russia, of course, was not okay with this. The president of the Ukraine at the time, Viktor Yanukovych, was deliberating on whether to take a EU financial aid package or a Russian one. Eventually, behind closed doors, the Ukrainian head of state chose the Russian deal, and then protests and riots erupted in the capital, Kiev. The American administration at the time encouraged the protests and the removal of Viktor Yanukovych. U.S. State Department official Victoria Nuland was even spotted in Kiev, giving out refreshments to protesters. When the Ukrainian president fled, a new government took over. Almost as soon as this happened, pro-Russian separatists took over the two oblasts that make up the Donbass, which are Donetsk and Luhansk. A war broke out there which quickly became a stalemate, which saw the comeback of First World War trench-style warfare and the rise of drones. Meanwhile, the regular Russian army landed in the Crimean Peninsula, the home of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, and seized it from the Ukrainians. This Ukrainian civil war dragged on for another 8 years until Russian President Vladimir Putin invaded with less than 200,000 troops in February 2022. They pushed into Donbass to assist the pro-Russian separatists there and invaded Kharkov, Zaporozhye, and Kherson oblasts. They also invaded in the north from their ally Belarus and attempted to surround Kiev. Now, in my mind, this was an extreme intimidation-fueled negotiation tactic by the Russians. They were not seriously trying to conquer the whole country. If they were, they would have sent in a whole lot more than just 200,000 troops. Mind you, this is a country of some 40 million people, which was about the population of Poland in 1939, and Hitler invaded it with about 1.5 million men. This army, besides being undersized, was also not at all prepared. They were not up to date in drone warfare and seriously lacked in this area. Quickly, the Ukrainians would ambush Russian armored columns with shoulder-fired MPAD missiles and use drones to destroy them. The Russians took a lot of losses in the first months of the war. Realizing they were unprepared and overstretched, the Russians withdrew from the environs of Kiev and reconstituted in the Donbass. There, they struggled on until September and October, when the Ukrainians launched a surprise offensive, which resulted in the capture of large swaths of land in Kharkov and Kherson oblasts. After this debacle, the Russians reset by appointing a new commander in charge and dug in all along the front line to establish a solid defense. They also instituted a draft which saw around 300,000 reservists and former military called up, plus around 80,000 volunteers sign up. They then started to mass-produce drones, missiles, and artillery shells. Meanwhile, the West took a different approach to aiding Ukraine. They would every few weeks or months give them piecemeal weapons and funding, seemingly just enough to keep them going. They would also train a brigade or battalion at a time in Western countries. Furthermore, despite Russia's large industrial potential and huge stockpiles of weapons and ammunition, neither the United States or any European country fully activated their military-industrial production. I'm not sure if this is due to over-regulation on their economies, but Russia certainly did activate their wartime economy. I believe all these actions by the West is indicative of them not being prepared to support Ukraine adequately for this war. They seem to have thought that the Ukrainian military and government would collapse in the first weeks or even days of the war. This did not happen. What happened instead was an old-fashioned conventional state versus state-industrial war of attrition, a war not seen in Europe since the World Wars. The West was not prepared for this. For the past 20 years, they have fought low-intensity insurgency wars, wars that do not require the level of armament and ammo that conventional wars do. So back to the war. Russia drafts hundreds of thousands of experienced soldiers, while Ukraine endlessly launches small-scale local offensives all along the front line. These piecemeal attacks would typically involve a company or battalion at a time. They would lose dozens in each attack. And meanwhile, Russia is mass-producing tanks, missiles, drones, and artillery shells. While retooling their army, the Kremlin turned to the Wagner paramilitary company to buy them time by allowing them to recruit some 50,000 convicts. Wagner used these convicts to launch offensives in Donetsk that culminated in the capture of Soledar and Bakhmut. The Ukrainians tenaciously held on to Bakhmut for months, mainly for public relations in mind, in my opinion. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians were preparing for their own offensive with a force of over 100,000, including several NATO-trained and armed brigades. This offensive was pointed at Zaporozhye Oblast, which sits in between the Donbass in the east and Crimea to the southwest. If successful, it would cut the Russians in Donbass off by land from Crimea, effectively splitting the Russian army in two in Ukraine. This operation could have worked, but the Russians' defensive proved very extensive and prepared, and the Ukrainians were a little too open about their intentions. They filmed a widely viewed trailer for the offensive as if this was an upcoming movie. I'm not sure what the purpose for this was, but I'm sure it has something to do with the influence of the Ukrainian president's past as a comedian and actor. This summer offensive started in early June and failed miserably. They only managed to capture a handful of rural hamlets and villages. In the effort, they also lost hundreds of pieces of equipment and tens of thousands of men. It was basically a turkey shoot for the Russians. It was a total and complete disaster which saw the key role of Russian aviation destroying NATO equipment at will. Since this debacle, the Ukrainians have not recovered. With increasingly shrinking aid packages from the West and inconsistent reinforcements from their recruitment campaigns, they're wavering. Meanwhile, the Russians have only gained in strength, with well over 500,000 men in Ukraine and constantly pummeling the Ukrainians with their 10-to-1 artillery advantage. As a last-ditch effort, the Ukrainians have burst their way into Russian Kursk Oblast. Predictably, this did not result in much with unclear objectives. They may have been aiming for a nuclear power plant in Kursk, which they could have used as a bargaining chip for peace. Whatever is the case, it did not work. With their power grid constantly getting bombarded, a steady Russian offensive slowly gobbling up more land every day, and now even the North Koreans sending thousands of troops, joining their old Cold War allies in the Russians, the future of Ukraine seems bleak.